Hello and welcome, Warhammer fans. Happy Halloween and happy Orktober. Don't get too excited, my Orktober video will show up at some point, but for now, let's focus on Halloween, and to remain on theme, my third Warhammer Fantasy lore video on the various races will be about vampires, otherwise known as the Vampire Counts. But before that, first I want to apologize to my Warhammer followers. It's been a hot minute since I've made any Warhammer videos, and while my next few planned videos aren't Warhammer, it's fucking Orktober and Halloween, so I'm making this a Warhammer themed month. Also, just to direct you down below, I'm linking my new Patreon page. If you want to help support the channel, it's just $2 to pledge, or $3 if you're feeling feisty. It really helps out, and I try to peddle out content to make it worthwhile. Also, of course, liking, subscribing, and commenting on my videos helps too. Okay, now that I said that, let's talk about the cool shit. Now, vampires in the Warhammer world are probably my favorite incarnations of the classical mythic vampire. They're bloody, horrifying, nightmarish, hedonistic, and over the top. But of course, not all vampires are the same. The Undying, or the Arisen as they call themselves, do have various different bloodlines based on what you would call a blood sire. If a von Karstein turns someone else into a vampire, the von Karstein in question is the blood sire, and the person they turned is now of the von Karstein bloodline. Their lineage in life no longer matters, and their blood sire will make sure they know that. Also, one must note that as far as this scholar can tell, only humans can become vampires, as the original vampires were human. Let's give a brief history lesson on how vampires came to be before I begin talking about the various types of vampires one might find in the old world. Thousands of years ago, the king of the undead, Nagash, terrorized Neferata and any neighboring states that contested his rule. Having risen to the title of priest king, the other priest kings loathed and feared him, and created a coalition in order to halt his campaign of terror and conquest. After many bloody years, they were successful, at least to a point. Nagash was not dead, but he fled into hiding. Now, we go to the two rulers in the city of Lamia, named Neferata and her brother Lamashazar, both wishing to learn the secrets of Nagash to extend their lifespans. Though they were allies, they each schemed against one another. Lamashazar eventually came into contact with Nagash's vizier and chief lieutenant, Arkhan the Black, and they made an alliance in secret and traveled to the Black Pyramid of Nagash to delve into Nagash's forbidden texts to learn greater power. Lamashazar enslaved Arkhan after he attempted to kill him. He brought the books and Arkhan back to Lamia, where he sought to recreate Nagash's elixir and become immortal. Unwilling to kill humans to fuel the elixir because of a fear of being found out, he and his cabal of followers instead used animals. They extended their lives but did not make themselves immortal. Neferata was frustrated with the lack of progress on her part, and desiring power for herself, she allied with Arkhan in secret and with his help created a new elixir, using it to turn the cabal to her side. Lamashazar eventually attempted to kill her using Sphinx venom, which, with its magical properties, could overwhelm the elixir's power. Arkhan, however, used sorcery and his own foul blood, and he was able to save her. Arkhan then sought and killed Lamashazar in his bedchamber, and after which Arkhan was found and cut down by Abhorash, who was Lamia's most formidable warrior, and he's later going to be very important. Neferata, though, through a combination of the Sphinx venom and elixir, turned into the first vampire. She then proceeded to turn the rest of the cabal, consisting of Lord Usharin, Wasorin, Naima, Lord Ankat, Zuraz, Abhorash, and several others, into vampires using the same method, though Abhorash had to be tricked into drinking the elixir. Each of the 12 masters, Neferata included, bore particular traits, and they could expand their lineage by creating vampire servants, but through each successive generation, the powers of the vampire weakened. Abhorash became the first blood dragon vampire, Wosorin the first Necrarch vampire, and Neferata became the first Lamian vampire. However, there was a man who had been Neferata's consort, named Alcadazar, or Alcadazar the Conqueror, later. A righteous man who had supped from the elixir of life as his queen and lover had, only he rose above the curse of the vampire and knew both Nagash and the vampires of Neferata were a blight upon the land. He raised an army, a massive force that had the strength to sack Lamia, and so he did so. 5 of the 12 original vampires were slain in the fighting, and the rest fled north only to be taken under Nagash's wing as his 7 captains. Now, Nagash then sent his 7 captains back with a massive force of undead to take back Nehekhara, but Alcatazar defeated the army. Nagash, in his petty vengeance, sent a plague over the land that killed thousands and turned them into more undead servants. This toppled Alcatazar's kingdom, and Alcatazar was taken away in chains in Nagash's fortress of Warpstone. Only just before Nagash had finished a ritual that would have turned the entire world into a land of the dead, Alcatazar was freed by the Skaven and given a sword of Warpstone. The man then killed Nagash, at least for now. Nagash's body was dead, at least, and Alcatazar died by the river of his beloved but fallen homeland. Of course, what vampires were left fled or went away in hiding once more, and they began to feed upon living men, and turning them into vampires themselves. And thousands upon thousands of years passed as their bloodlines grew in number, and the vampires we know of today came to be. Now, it's good to note that as the vampiric bloodline continue, each new vampire is weaker and less intelligent than the last, meaning one day, turning a human into a vampire will make a mindless, blood-crazed beast. Although, something to note, modern vampires are still extremely powerful, and even though an ancient vampire is stronger, it's all about potential. A modern vampire has less potential, but that doesn't mean they can't defeat their ancestors or blood sires if they really work at it. A 700-year-old vampire can get killed by a 300-year-old vampire they turned 300 years ago if the latter one reaches closer to their potential and the former, older one doesn't. Because so far in the modern Warhammer world, being turned into a vampire always has great potential. After you get turned, you wake up feeling famished and dehydrated of blood, but you'll also be many times faster and stronger than a normal man. You still have plenty to learn and master, and many powers to awaken, however. Not to mention, most vampires learn sorcery because, well, they have centuries to perfect anything, and magic is a powerful tool, so why not? Anyway, I went off on a tangent. Let's get into the different bloodlines of vampires. First, let's talk about the most prominent and arguably the most dangerous vampires, being the von Karstein bloodline. They are the descendants of Vashanesh, Neferata's husband. They're also the most famous vampires, having raised the most armies, having attacked the Empire the most, and they're also the ones that have gotten the closest to succeeding and conquering the living. They're usually conniving, intelligent, ambitious, skillful in magic, and they're proud, even among other vampires. I mean, even other vampires treat them with a certain amount of respect or jealousy, as if they were vampire aristocracy. Speaking of which, they are actual aristocrats in the Empire, hailing from Sylvania. Sylvania used to be its own province, but now it's a part of Greater Stirland, though the vampire counts still rule it in secret regardless. Oh, and von Karsteins also have an affinity with animals, particularly bats and wolves. Next up are the Lamians, and you guessed it, they hail from the Queen of Vampires herself, Neferata, who once ruled the Kingdom of Lamia. Lamians are pretty much entirely made of females, though there are a few exceptions. The most notable being Adolphus Krieger, the main antagonist of Vampire Slayer in the Gotrek and Felix series. Now, Lamians are what you might consider the most humane vampires, generally. Adolphus Krieger was a bit of an exception, but Lamians usually treat humans better than most, though you still wouldn't want to be a victim of theirs. A friend of mine once asked me if there were any nice vampires in the Warhammer world. In order to answer that, you'd need to define what nice means. Lamians could be considered nice, in a sense. Unless someone threatens them or their servants, they don't really kill people. Killing leaves questions, and Lamians tend to live within human society more than any of the others. They are the noble women that are always veiled in the shadows. They are the harlot that works at night, loosening your tongue. They are the lovely tavern wenches that overhear your secrets. Lamians tend to view feeding on humans like we might view sex. What two consensual adults do in a private bedchamber is between them, they would say. The fact that one of the adults is unnaturally enchanting and makes the other addicted to their bloodthirst, making them a supernaturally willing servant, is never really mentioned in that, though. However, so you could say that the Lamians are nice in some cases, but I would call them diplomatic, rather. In fact, in my opinion, I would say that their methods are more closer to rape than consensual, just because vampires have that effect on human beings. It takes away the human being's drive to resist, often. But hey, they would argue against that. A Lamian will kill to protect themselves or their flock, and a Lamian still considered humans lesser. I'll give a quote from a Lamian vampire named Gabriela von Nachthofen, who is teaching another younger vampire to remain discreet. Every vampire has an obligation to every other vampire to be discreet, to feed covertly, to live privately, for when one is discovered, it riles the sheep and endangers us all. If I were to let you rage throughout the countryside, slaughtering indiscriminately, the witch hunters wouldn't just come for you. They would begin to wonder who else might have hidden fangs. They would prowl about, asking questions and bringing lanterns and silvered blades into crypts. I can't allow that, and so you must be taught. You must learn not to feed. You must learn to control your hunger lest it control you, exposing you, and me, to the cattle's ignorant wrath. Don't let the diplomacy fool you, however. They are much stronger and faster than a human, Lamians. It's also worth noting that Lamians are the most widespread bloodline in terms of square mileage, as you'll likely have a small group of them in every major city in the Empire, and probably in other human countries too, working in the shadows. Though they still have a large presence in Sylvania, second only to the von Karsteins. Now onto the Blood Dragons. Their original bloodsire was Abhorash, who I mentioned earlier, formerly Queen Neferata's champion and bodyguard, and likely the greatest warrior in Necrarch at the time, and probably ever since. He is likely the greatest physical combatant among vampires there ever was, which fits the Blood Dragons as they're the best at martial combat. The Blood Dragons are often fallen Bretonnian knights, actually, but they in no way need to be. They get their name from when their progenitor, Abhorash, traveled into the World's Edge Mountains after the vampires were scattered, and one day the vampire found an immense red dragon sleeping in a cave. Now, reports differ on what actually happened. Some say he fed on the dragon in secret as it slept. A more popular version, and the one that Blood Dragons tell, was that Abhorash and the dragon fought a terrible duel that echoed across the mountains for a full day, until Abhorash managed to sink his sword into the dragon and cut its heart out. Abhorash sinking his fangs into the dragon's gaping wound and sucking up what blood he could. Either way, once he drank the dragon's blood, the most miraculous thing happened. He was freed of his torment of constant thirst, and no longer needed to feed on blood to survive. He was effectively immortal, without the constraints of feeding. The Blood Dragons now try to follow his example, fighting among battlefields to gain glory and renown, and most of all, seeking dragons to slay. As stated, they have a weird relationship with Bretonnia. Abhorash actually swore fealty to Bretonnia's founding king, and yet at the same time, one of the worst scourges of Bretonnian history was a blood dragon called the Red Duke, who nearly destroyed the country, so it's complicated. Also, most blood dragons tend to have an undead steed they share a very close bond with. Next up are the Necrarchs, whose bloodsire some call the father of vampires, was Sauron the Wicked. He was one of the few who remained secretly loyal to Nagash throughout the fighting against him and even after his quote-unquote death, knowing Nagash to be the greatest necromancer and sorcerer of the age. Sauron was the only one who was allowed to be handed Nagash's works after he was slain, and he left the lands of the dead to continue his research. Necrarchs are the most hideous-looking vampires, looking like wizened and decrepit ghoul-like figures that men find offensive to even gaze upon. Necrarchs tend to keep hidden away in ancient tombs and mountain vaults, ever continuing their research of forbidden secrets. They're the least physically capable of the vampires, however, they're still extremely dangerous in hand-to-hand combat compared to your average human. What they lack in physical strength, they make up for in magical might, however. If you find a Necrarch, you better kill one quicker than they could wave their hands. A Necrarch gives Elven Archmages a run for their money, and you could easily say they are Nagash's mystical legacy. Sauron first turned his aged acolytes into vampires, and through dark magic they made it so they only needed to feed once every few years. However, this made them hideous to look upon and their minds twisted along with their bodies. Despite how intelligent a Necrarch is and how good they are at alchemy and sorcery, you'll find they're also quite insane, probably because they also spend years, centuries alone. Now, last but not least, we have a simple but interesting bloodline. These are the Strigoi. These Strigoi are brutish and bestial, and just as the Blood Dragons are the most skilled and powerful at arms, the Strigoi are the best hand-to-hand melee combatants, without weapons, as they represent the bestial power of the Vampiric curse the most. And just as they can match the Blood Dragons in their own way, they can also match the Necrarchs in hideousness. Their original bloodsire is Ushoran, who was Neferata's younger brother. Neferata granted her elixir of life to all of the members at court, save her younger brother, for she still wanted someone to be inferior to her at court. Her pettiness was not lost on Ushoran, who stole the elixir anyway and drank it. Yushorin became primal, and even more bullheaded than he was in life. After the fall of Neferata and Nagash, Yushorin created a kingdom in the Badlands, and for 200 years, the Strigoi prospered until they became decadent and sluggish. It was then that Neferata sent mortal armies and vampire assassins to attack the kingdom in vengeance for Yushorin's stealing of her elixir. Though they didn't succeed in destroying the kingdom, it left it vulnerable to an orc invasion that shattered it. The Strigoi lost their cohesion, and they became pariahs and degenerates, now losing much of their former intelligence to animalistic savagery. Now whenever you see a Strigoi, they're either lone wolves or a part of another bloodlines group used as the muscle. Strigoi have also been noted to have various forms, such as a bestial form and a more humanoid form, but it can differentiate from Strigoi to Strigoi. Some might actually pass as human sometimes, albeit a very large and hairy human. These are rare, however. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some of the vampire's abilities. I can't name all of them because over Warhammer editions and the various lore retcons, along with Games Workshop purposefully being vague so as to keep some lore mystery, it's hard to tell what goes with what bloodline and what comes with age or certain mystical practices. Some vampires are naturally inclined to dark magic, and I'm not simply speaking of Necrarchs. Some Lamians and von Karsteins have a natural affinity, and perhaps even blood dragons or Strigoi in rare examples. Some vampires can turn into ethereal and gaseous forms, and others can transform parts of their body or their entire body into a bat. Or anything, really. As I said earlier, von Karsteins have a special affinity with bats and wolves. Many vampires can command undead, even without studying necromancy, though it certainly helps. Ghouls and zombies can be controlled through many vampires' wills. Some vampires can even read minds. Vampires do have an aversion to silver and sunlight, universally. I'm going to now dive into a small reading of the book Vampire Slayer, when Adolphus Krieger, as I mentioned earlier, is giving a lecture on vampire strengths and weaknesses to a younger, newly turned vampire. "Let me die," she said. She felt miserable physically and mentally. Her body was racked by sickness, her mind by self-hatred and guilt. "You will not die unless you kill yourself or someone kills you. You feel terrible now because you drank too much blood. It is a common mistake among the newly risen. In some ways it is like what happens when a starving man sits down to a banquet. His stomach simply cannot deal with all the food he eats. In other ways, it's like what happens after a human indulges in too much wine. There is what you might call a hangover. I do not want to live. I killed a man for no reason. You killed a man to extend your life. People do it every day. We have discussed this. Oh, now you feel guilty because it goes against many of the hypocrisies you have been taught since you were a child, but believe me, this too shall pass. I do not want to change the way I feel, but you will. Trust me, you will. I don't think so. We all say that at first. You're so sure of yourself, aren't you? She sneered. Adolphus Krieger shrugged. I've every reason to be. I have gone through what you have gone through, and I know that one day you will thank me for doing you the greatest favor anyone has ever done for you. Turning me into a monster, turning you into an immortal. She rose up on her elbow to stare at him. She felt like lashing out. She wanted to take her nails and slash his face to the bone, to bury her fangs in his throat. He took a step back. It would be extremely foolish of you to turn on me now, he said. I know things that you need to know. Without that knowledge, you will be prey to any passing vampire who decides to take advantage of you. It seems to me that you have already done that. True, but I am your progenitor. You are my get. I have certain responsibilities to you just as you have certain responsibilities to me. In a very real sense, you are my child. I already have a father. You had a father. What do you think he will do to you if he finds out what you are now? She paused for a second. She knew what her father would do. The people of Kislev did not suffer monsters to live in their midst. That thought sent a flash of pain through her chest. No matter how much her father had once loved her, he would do his duty. It would pain him unto death, but he would do what he had to. Look at it another way, Krieger continued mercilessly. What do you think you might do to him if you were near him when the thirst overtook you? An image of doing what she had done to the fat merchant to her own father flashed through her mind. It was at once horrifying and strangely attractive. She shuddered and tried to force the picture from her mind, but it would not go. I see you do understand. It is best if you break all mortal ties now. You are still a neophyte. You would not be able to control yourself when the killing lust came upon you. Would I be able to one day? Good. You are beginning to adjust to your new state, to accept it. She realized that she was. She had taken to her new condition far too easily. Part of it was sheer Kislevite pragmatism. She was what she was and nothing could change that now, but part of it was something else. You were doing something to my mind, she said. He nodded like a teacher pleased with a particularly apt pupil. It is because I am your progenitor. There is a link between us that is very strong. Also it is this, he said, indicating the talisman at his throat. It is well that you understand your position from the start. There is much I have to teach you, and we do not have a huge amount of time. Soon we will both be very busy. Doing what? Carving out a new kingdom here in Sylvania, ruling the night, and setting our servants to rule the day. Do you really think you can do that? I have already started. Now listen, there is much you have to learn. Such was the compulsion implicit in his words that she fell silent and simply stared at him, waiting for him to share his infernal wisdom. You will find that many things have changed. You no longer need to eat or drink as mortals do. Blood will provide you with all the sustenance you need. It is everything to you now. It is the be-all and end-all of your unlife. It will nourish you, heal you, and provide you with power the likes of which you could only dream about when you were mortal. With it you can maintain your existence forever. Without it. He paused for a moment and glanced out the window as if considering something. You will not die, not as others understand it. Something worse will happen. Worse? You will simply wither away, losing strength and youth and beauty. Your muscles will shrivel, your mind will deteriorate. You will not be able to move or speak or think. Your body will become a withered, desiccated husk, and yet part of you will live on, imprisoned in it, aware in a very dim way of what has happened to you and what you once were. It will be a long eternity of torment and hunger, tortured by the thirst but unable to slake it. It is something like hell. You speak as if you have experienced it, she said softly. The beginnings of it, once long ago. I was saved when another brought me blood. It gave me enough strength to hunt for myself once more, but enough of these ancient memories. I was telling you what you need to know. Then go on, she said, a little sulkily. He reached out and touched her cheek. A thrill passed through her body. The feel of his cold skin on hers aroused a strange sensation in her. He smiled as if he knew what she was feeling. I told you there was a link between us. Some of my blood is in you, just as one day some of your blood will be in your get. We are bound now by blood and by darkness. Tonight I will tell you the essentials of what you need to know. The rules are simple. Do not go out by day if you can possibly help it. Find yourself a safe place and keep out of sight. Why? You sometimes do it. I have a tolerance for light. Some do not. Sunlight burns some of our kind as surely as flaming oil. Some are merely made torpid unless they have taken a great deal of blood, and even then their minds are not sharp. The only way to find out which type you are is to risk it and see, and that is not something you should do unless you are in the greatest of danger and swathed in the thickest cloak you can find, exposing as little flesh as possible. Could I not simply expose some skin, say, on the back of my hand for a short space of time? You could. If you are willing to see it melt away into a stump if you are one of those who are vulnerable. And sometimes for some of the arisen there is an increased risk. Sunlight does not burn them immediately, it scorches their skin after prolonged exposure, blistering it and cracking it and causing the most extreme agony. It's like a case of sunburn to a mortal, only 1,000 times worse. Why is this? I am not a natural philosopher, I do not know. I can only tell you the stories I have heard. Some say the sun god of the long-dead kingdom of Necrarch cursed our kind. Others say it is because we are saturated with dark magic that is disrupted by sunlight. The only thing I know for certain is that all of our kind are almost blind by day compared to how well we see at night. Something in our eye changes, adapting it to darkness and making it too sensitive to the sun's light. It is best to sleep through the day, it is when we become naturally torpid anyway. Can I fly, turn myself into a bat? She realized it was a childish question, but being able to fly like a bird was a childhood dream, and perhaps she could find something good in what had happened to her. Transformation can be learned, but the mastery is a long and difficult process. I will teach you what I know of it when I have the time. For the present, you should be content with what you have. Mortal diseases no longer affect you. You are now many times stronger and hardier and faster than any mortal man, and you are invulnerable to many of their weapons. Why? Most of your internal organs are useless to you now. Over time they will atrophy. A blade to the belly will do you no real harm. Most wounds will heal very quickly when you take enough blood. What about a stake through the heart? Ah, that old chestnut. Yes, that will harm you. Any blow there will. Your heart still beats, albeit so slowly as to be undetectable except after you have drunk. It still pumps blood through your body, though. If it is shattered, then it will take a long time to repair itself. You will still live, but all things I told you about the lack of blood will apply. It will be a period of torture, and at the end of it, you may be too weak to feed. You should also protect your head. It is the seat of your soul, or at least your mind. If your brain is damaged, you will go mad, or lose memories, or become an unthinking, soulless brute. Having your head parted from your body, having the brain scooped out and burned, is the surest way of finding a real death. You would do well to avoid it. What about magical powers? I've always heard that vampires gain many sorcerous powers through the pacts with the Dark Ones. Our powers do not come from the Lords of Chaos, but they are very real. There are many ways to compel mortals to your will, to fascinate them, bedazzle them, and ultimately to command them. Again, these things take a long time to master, and I will teach you how to use them as I can and when I can. It seems you intend to keep me very dependent upon you. Why not? These are traditional roles in our society, and I am the master. You are the apprentice. I will teach, and in return you will obey. And if I do not want to, what will you do then? He smiled, showing all his teeth, and gestured to the talisman at his throat. Believe me, you have no choice. I command you to obey me in all things, to serve and protect me, until I release you from this binding. Even as he spoke, she felt the compulsion settle on her mind like a burning fetters hot from the forge being hammered onto the limbs of a condemned prisoner. She wanted to scream and to resist, but there was nothing she could do. The power of the Eye of Khemri and all of the will behind it was too great. She knew she was overwhelmed now, as surely as she had been by the red thirst earlier. Part of her actually wanted to obey. The spell was very strong. This is a very great honor for you. You will be the first of many bound to my service. Together we will forge a new empire and bring a new age of darkness to the world. Now, plot of the book aside, this goes to show that even a vampire doesn't know the extent of his kind's powers. Adolphus Krieger wasn't sure of a lot of things. As vampires themselves are widespread and mixed throughout different bloodlines, there isn't a council where they get together and talk to each other over what they can or cannot do. At least, not since ancient times. Now, onto the last section of the video concerning geopolitics, if one can call it that. I'm referring to how vampires coexist with other species and races in the Warhammer world. Now, as most of you know, most races in the Warhammer world are fairly racist. This goes doubly for the vampires. In fact, they're likely even more racist than elves and dwarves. Vampires think themselves truly above all others, and they fear pretty much no single race or being except Nagash himself in their heart of hearts. Let's start with humans, which have the most complicated relationship with the vampires. Humans are the vampire's lifeblood, pun intended. Humans are the main source of nutrients for vampires. They're also their main source of servants, being either living or undead such as zombies and skeleton. And above all else, only humans can become vampires as far as this scholar can tell. Likely because the elixir of life that created vampirism was originally used on ancient humans. So without humanity, there really are no vampires, and yet vampire opinions range in the matter of men. Some loathe them, and others pity them for their weaknesses that vampires have risen above. Many, particularly the von Karsteins, see humans as lost, ignorant fools that should be ruled over by the wise and powerful vampires. Although it is to be said, humans can also be their greatest allies. Many times have human necromancers and vampires allied in the past, oftentimes being on equal footing or the necromancer being subservient to the vampire, but there have been a few rare occasions where the necromancer has made a vampire their servant to be used in battle or other tasks. Let's not forget, every vampire and even Nagash himself was once human. Something to add on finally is that humans are also generally a vampire's biggest enemies by proximity. Vampires need humans to survive, and they cannot wipe out humanity lest they starve, and so they play a delicate balance with humans who have specialized in very dangerous members of their communities, such as witch hunters, knights, holy magic, warrior priests, and wizards. Even past the Empire, a Grail Knight of Bretonnia or a Fey Enchantress are dangerous foes for vampires to face. Now, let's talk about elves and how the Arisen view them. Though it's true they don't come into contact with one another often, elves and vampires actually have quite a lot in common. Both are magically inclined, both are supernaturally quick, many of either race can be considered supernaturally enchanting in a way, and both are very long-lived, so they have similar, unchanging outlooks on the world. It's true that vampires are effectively immortal, whereas elves just live a long time, but honestly, vampires are a relatively new addition to the Warhammer world in terms of history. Let's take one of the original vampires, like Neferata or Abhorash. Most people think they have been slain, but let's say one of them is alive right now. They would be at most, 2,000 years old? That's about a quarter of how long Malekith the Witch King has been around, and if we're counting the elves in the Vortex, they're even older. Now, those are exceptional elves, but it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to see an elf in Ulthuan that is close to a millennia old or older, and most vampires would not be that old. It's certainly an exceptional feat to see a vampire that is 1,000 years old. Most older veteran vampires are around 400 to 600 years old, generally, even if they have the capability to live forever. But back to business. Vampires don't particularly get along with elves, but they do in some cases respect elven power at least. It is my contention that a vampire can also indeed feed upon an elf, but that's only my theory. Nothing has ever suggested that they can't, so... Oh boy, let's get to my favorite topic, dwarves. Vampires and dwarves hate each other. Granted, dwarves hate vampires a bit more than the other way around, but vampires do have an enmity against the stout folk. If it weren't for the dwarves, the vampires might not have lost that pivotal battle at Hel Finn 200 years ago. That and vampires would never meet a dwarf that would ever be considered an ally. Dwarves are immune to vampiric enchantments and charms. They're resistant to magic, they're tough and harder to physically dominate than men, and dwarves tend to have magical weaponry that can really fuck a vampire up. That and vampires don't particularly like drinking dwarf blood. It's too thick for their tastes. You could make the argument that dwarves are suited for fighting vampires in a lot of respects. Usually when a vampire fights someone like a man or an elf, he has something to gain. Either he can gain a thrall or at least a meal, but fighting a dwarf, they can only really survive or lose. That's not to say they fear dwarves, but they see a dwarf as an unnecessary risk to fight usually, unless the vampire is particularly brutish or bloodthirsty, so yeah, they don't get along. Moving on, let's talk about greenskins, ogres, and skaven. I put all these together because vampires tend to not really think on any of these races unless they invade a vampire's home. You can make the argument that the Strigoi dislike orcs more than most because they destroyed their home, and Necrarchs tend to bump into skaven and goblins underground often, feeding off of them or stealing warp zone for their experiments, but generally these races are fodder or enemies. Now onto the lizardmen. It's sort of pretty much the same as the above three. The only reason I separate them from the others is that we have a great example of lizardmen fighting and hating vampires in the form of Luthor Harkon, the blood dragon vampire that found his coffin transported to the New World, only for him to awaken and create an undead fleet. Yes, that's right, he's a pirate vampire with zombie pirates and other types of undead under his command. He's been fighting the lizardmen ever since on the vampire coast that he controls, for territory and for magical slan artifacts and lustria. Next up on the roster, we have an interesting faction to speak on. Chaos. How do vampires view chaos and other various factions under it? Well, contrary to what you might think, vampires and chaos worshippers tend not to get along. One can certainly make the argument that vampires, and indeed all undead, are semi-related to chaos, but that's about where the similarities end. Chaos is looking to warp and utterly destroy the world, which is completely against the ideals of vampires. Vampires become vampires to remain unchanged throughout the ages, and if the world is destroyed, who will the vampires feed and rule over? Now, that's not to say vampires have never ever been tangentially allied with certain chaos factions, but they are the exceptions and not the rule. Something else to note is that followers of chaos that are particularly ingrained with chaos magic, or chaos influence, have blood that is downright poisonous to vampires. If a vampire drinks the tainted blood of a Kurgan, for instance, there's a very real chance the vampire could get sick or even fully die unless treated. Okay, the final faction we have to speak on are the Tomb Kings. Those unfamiliar with Warhammer might actually think they will be allies, but truthfully, they hate each other. In fact, they probably have the most hatred to each other. They have the longest grudge. The reasoning is back in the history lesson. The vampires, though they initially fought against Nagash, either followed him or tried to recreate what he had made. The Tomb Kings instead were given unlife by Nagash's great ritual, without their consent. They're the Necrarch kings long dead and buried, mummified and awoken in that fateful time long ago. The vampires view the Tomb Kings as residing in their rightful inheritance, whereas the Tomb Kings see vampires as ancient traitors and Nagash loyalists. The Tomb Kings even raise their armies in a different way, eschewing the dark arts of necromancy for a different kind of magic wrought by their ancient Nehecaran lich priests. They might both be undead monsters, but that is where the similarities stop. They truly dislike each other. Oh man, that was a long-ass video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Happy Halloween, and I hope you enjoy my next videos. Thanks, guys.